The disappearance of a young woman on a warm summer evening sent shockwaves through a small town in Punjab. Her trail vanished abruptly, leaving behind only questions and mysteries. Just days before she disappeared, Jazz had seemed happy, her life brimming with hope. But who could have guessed that something far darker and more sinister lurked beneath the surface? John, Punjab, India, 1994. This quiet town, threaded with narrow alleyways and the bustling sounds of rickshaws, was experiencing something unusual. Sukhwinder Singh Sidhu, better known as Mithu, wasn't just an ordinary rickshaw driver. To many of John's residents, especially the younger crowd, he was a true local legend. Mithu stood out for his vibrant energy, athletic prowess, and his skill in a game called Kadi, a traditional team sport that required agility, strength, and teamwork. He was the captain of his team, and his name echoed across the area. Mithu was always dedicated to his work and his sport, but that fall, something occurred that changed the course of his usual routines. Jaswinder Kaur Sidhu, or simply Jazz, had arrived in John in November 1994 to visit relatives. A calm and gentle young woman accustomed to a quiet life, she had inevitably heard stories about the talented local athlete and rickshaw driver named Mithu. His name often popped up in conversations, and soon her curiosity was piqued. Who was this man everyone seemed to hold in such high regard? She hadn't planned on meeting him, but fate had different ideas. One morning began like any other at the rickshaw stop. Jazz and her mother stood waiting for transport to take them to the local market. As they waited, Jazz had no idea that this would be the day she would meet the man she had heard so much about. When a rickshaw pulled up in front of them, she saw a young driver with an intense gaze. It was Mithu. He noticed Jazz right away, and his eyes lit up with interest. Jazz and her mother took their seats on the back bench, joined by a few other passengers. As the rickshaw made its way through the town's narrow streets, Mithu couldn't help but glance back at the young woman several times. Each exchange of glances was fleeting, but significant enough to linger in their minds for the rest of the day. Mithu, who was usually focused on the road and his duties, found his attention increasingly drawn to the mysterious girl sitting behind him. Jazz couldn't remain indifferent either. She felt his gaze on her, and it left her feeling slightly self-conscious but also intrigued. She tried not to look in his direction, but at one point, their eyes did meet, and a faint smile passed between them. It was a fleeting moment, but it left a lasting impression on both of them. When the rickshaw finally came to a stop, Jazz and her mother stepped out. For a moment, she turned around and caught Mithu's gaze once more. This time, it lingered longer than before. There was something unspoken in that look, something they both seemed to understand without words. This encounter was accidental, but it held a significance neither of them could have anticipated. Jazz went about the rest of her day, but the thoughts of that rickshaw driver, who had looked at her with a mix of curiosity and warmth, refused to leave her mind. Mithu, on his end, couldn't shake the memory of that brief interaction and the exchange of glances which seemed to communicate more than any conversation ever could. That day marked the beginning of something new, though neither Jazz nor Mithu knew where this path would lead them. Night fell over John as Mithu returned home after a long day of work. Exhaustion settled in, and he decided to rest for a while in his room. However, the peace was shattered by sudden cries from outside. "Somebody help us! We need assistance!" Mithu rushed out to see two girls stranded by the side of the road. One of them was Jazz, the very same girl he had driven earlier that day. They were in trouble. Their scooter had broken down, and they couldn't handle the issue on their own. Mithu approached them without hesitation, offering his help right away. He began examining the scooter carefully, trying to figure out what was wrong. After several attempts to get the engine started, he finally identified the problem and managed to fix it. Jazz was grateful, but communication was challenging. Jazz spoke only English, while Mithu spoke Punjabi. Thankfully, Jazz's friend could translate for them, allowing them to exchange a few words. Later, Mithu learned that Jazz was staying with relatives who lived just 15 minutes away from his own house. He was 22 years old, and Jazz was 19. Young and full of energy, the interest between them was undeniable. The next evening, Mithu couldn't resist the urge to see Jazz again. He went to her relative's home, aware that her family was strict and would never approve of her having visitors, especially male ones. Jazz had to sneak out to the window to see him. They held hands and spoke through the window, even though much of their conversation was lost in translation due to the language barrier. Still, there was a special connection between them, one that didn't require words to be understood. Jazz's life was anything but free. Born in India, she moved to Canada with her parents, where they settled in a large house shared with extended family members. Surrounded by strict rules and many restrictions, her every move was monitored by her parents and other relatives, including aunts, uncles, and cousins. Jazz grew up in a world rooted in traditional values, where respecting elders and obeying family rules were of the utmost importance. Jazz was a quiet and reserved young woman, deeply committed to her cultural heritage. Life in Canada had not diminished her connection to Indian traditions. She had little interest in Western culture, avoided parties, and preferred calm, family-centered evenings. Education was her top priority, and even after moving to Canada, her views remained unchanged. She stayed true to her roots, even when surrounded by a different culture. In 1994, Jaswinder Kaur Sidhu traveled to India with her mother, Malkiat Kaur. They stayed with Jass's grandparents, who were prominent landowners and among the wealthiest people in the region. Their large, luxurious home and high social status made it clear that Jass's family held a special position in the community. Additionally, the family owned a business in Canada, which added to their influence. All decisions in the family were made by Jass's uncle, Surjit Singh, as her father, who struggled with schizophrenia, was unable to take an active role in family affairs. Surjit was a strict and commanding figure, and the family abided by his authority. Mithu, on the other hand, grew up in a poor family in Jeon. His parents were farmers and life was tough. After finishing high school, he started working immediately to support his family. Mithu was known for being hardworking and honest, and he earned the respect of those around him. Although driving a rickshaw didn't bring in much money, he was proud of his independence and did everything he could to provide for his loved ones. When Mithu learned that Jazz came from a wealthy and influential family, he felt uneasy. He understood the significant difference in their social statuses. Yet, despite this, Jazz and Mithu began seeing each other in secret. Their relationship was carefully hidden from Jazz's relatives, who would never have approved of her involvement with a poor rickshaw driver. But Jazz wasn't concerned with Mithu's financial standing. She valued him for his kindness and sincerity. As the day of Jazz's departure back to Canada approached, her spirits grew increasingly heavy. She couldn't bear the thought of leaving Mithu behind. Just days before her flight, Jazz made a desperate move. She tore up her passport and lied to her mother, claiming she had lost it. This allowed her to stay in India for an additional 20 days, while a new passport was processed. Her family was outraged by her actions, but they had no choice but to adapt to the situation. During those days, Jazz and Mithu spent every moment they could together, cherishing the time that remained. In January 1995, Jazz ultimately returned to Canada, but her connection with Mithu did not end. They maintained their relationship through letters and phone calls. Jazz wrote her letters in English, and Mithu replied in Punjabi. Friends helped them translate so they could understand each other better. Jazz even began learning Punjabi to communicate more easily with Mithu. Their phone calls were brief due to the high cost of international calls, but every conversation was precious to them. For 4 long years, they stayed in touch, holding on to dreams of a reunion. By 1999, Jazz's family returned to India with the intention of arranging her marriage. Her uncle, Surjit, had selected a match for her, a wealthy landowner who had recently turned 60. Jazz was stunned when she learned about the impending marriage. Her prospective husband was decades older than her, and the thought of marrying him was unbearable. Meanwhile, Mithu clung to hope for their future, despite the obstacles and barriers that stood between them. Jaswinder and Mithu were in love, but their relationship remained a closely guarded secret. Jaz's relatives would never have accepted her choice. She knew that if they discovered her feelings for a poor rickshaw driver, the consequences could be severe, possibly even life-threatening for Mithu. One day, Jaz confided in an aunt she trusted. "If I can't marry Mithu, I'll die without him," she confessed. Her aunt realized the gravity of the situation and offered to help find a solution. On March 15, 1999, Jaz and Mithu married in a quiet ceremony at a gurdwara, without anyone else knowing. Jaz returned home afterward, and no one discovered what had happened. The arranged marriage to the older man was initially postponed and eventually called off entirely. Jaz stayed in India for another 2 months, secretly meeting with Mithu, fully aware that if their relationship were exposed, the repercussions could be devastating. When it was time for Jaz to return to Canada, she promised Mithu that she would come back soon. They continued to stay in touch, and Mithu even managed to get a phone line installed at his home, making communication easier. However, in early 2000, Jaz's relatives in India found out about her secret wedding and informed her parents. The reaction was immediate. Her mother and uncle were furious. Jaz was confined to her room, forbidden from using the phone, and cut off from any way to contact her husband. A few days later, Jaz's mother, Malkiat Kaur, changed her approach. She came to her daughter and claimed that the family had decided to accept her relationship with Mithu. She assured Jaz they would help organize a grand wedding in India and even assist Mithu with moving to Canada. Jaz believed her mother's words and was overjoyed. A few days later, her mother asked her to sign a stack of documents, saying it was necessary for Mithu's visa application. Without much thought, Jaz quickly signed everything, including several blank sheets. What Jaz didn't know was that her relatives would later print a false statement on those blank sheets. The statement read, "I, Jaswinder Kaur Sidhu, declare that Sukhwinder Singh Sidhu, also known as Mithu, kidnapped me, attacked me, and forced me into marriage at gunpoint. I escaped to Canada as soon as I had the chance." These documents were submitted to the police in Punjab, and based on the false claims, Mithu was arrested. He was charged with kidnapping, coercing someone into marriage, and illegal possession of a weapon. Mithu spent several months behind bars, awaiting trial, while his family endured significant hardship because of the accusations. Back in Canada, Jaz continued writing letters to her husband Mithu, but she received no replies. Her attempts to call him were also unsuccessful. It wasn't long before Jaz realized that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, she learned through mutual acquaintances that Mithu had been imprisoned. She immediately suspected her relatives' involvement. Remembering how her mother and uncle had tricked her into signing those papers, Jaz realized it had all been part of a calculated plan. The situation was far worse than Jaz had imagined. The false accusations had swept up not just Mithu, but also 2 of his relatives and 2 friends, who were arrested under charges of being accomplices. These individuals had nothing to do with the marriage, but they were detained as part of the effort to pressure Mithu and his family. Jaz refused to give up. She managed to get through to Mithu by phone, but the conversation was strained. Mithu was angry and deeply hurt. He blamed Jaz for signing the documents that had led to his arrest. Jaz tried to explain that she had been deceived, that her trust had been exploited by her mother and uncle, and that she herself was now effectively under house arrest, forbidden from contacting anyone. Eventually, Jaz managed to escape her relatives' control. It is believed that her father, who was suffering from schizophrenia, and her brother helped her. With their support and the assistance of Canadian authorities, Jaz was able to leave her family's home and return to India. Once in Punjab, she approached the local police, pleading for Mithu and the others to be released. She gave a formal statement, testifying that none of them were guilty and that she had willingly married Mithu. After prolonged investigations and fact-checking, Mithu and his loved ones were finally released. Jaz decided to remain in India. promising Mithu she would not return to Canada. However, aware of the potential threats from her relatives, the couple began living in hiding. In June 2000, Mithu decided to take Jazz to his uncle's house, hoping she would feel safer there. A few days later, on June 7th, they received an unexpected phone call from Canada. Mithu's uncle answered and heard the voice of Malkiat Kaur, Jazz's mother. She asked to speak to her daughter. Jazz approached the phone cautiously. Her mother's tone was gentle. "My dear, what have you done? But it's okay. None of that matters now. The most important thing is your happiness. We want you and Mithu to be together and celebrate your wedding in style. I've taken care of everything, so don't worry." Mithu felt something was off. Not long after that call, the phone rang again. This time, Malkiat asked to speak to Mithu, and her tone had turned harsh. "You'll pay dearly for what you've done," she warned. Then Jazz's uncle Surjit joined the conversation, his words filled with threats. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. There will be consequences." Mithu hung up silently, not wanting to alarm Jazz, but a sense of dread settled in his chest. He knew they wouldn't be left in peace. Jazz suggested going to the market to buy a dress for an upcoming celebration on June 12th. Mithu was hesitant, worried about their safety, and initially refused. But seeing how excited she was, he agreed, thinking it would be a quick and uneventful outing. On June 8th, they headed to the market. Jazz picked out a dress, and Mithu paid for it. They then stopped at a cafe for coffee before starting their journey home. On their way back, trouble struck. Their scooter kept breaking down, forcing them to stop and seek help from a mechanic multiple times. It was already dark by the time they managed to get back on the road. Despite the delays, they tried to enjoy the moments they had together. Late that night, Mithu's parents received devastating news. Their son had been admitted to the hospital in critical condition. There was no word about Jazz's whereabouts. At the hospital, Mithu was unconscious. Hours later, he regained consciousness, and after receiving medical attention, he was able to give a statement to the police. Mithu recounted that on their way home, he noticed two men following them on a scooter. He chose not to tell Jazz, hoping to avoid frightening her. After a while, the strangers seemed to back off, and Mithu thought the danger had passed. But as they were nearing home, a car suddenly blocked their path, and 6 men emerged from it. Mithu stopped the scooter, confused and unsure of what was happening. Suddenly, the men pulled out wooden sticks and began attacking. Mithu tried desperately to defend himself and protect Jazz, but they were heavily outnumbered. One of the attackers struck him in the head, causing him to lose consciousness. Believing he was dead, the attackers dumped his body into a roadside ditch. As for what happened to Jazz, Mithu had no idea. Some workers passing by the ditch later found Mithu unconscious. They called for emergency medical help, and he was rushed to the hospital. Meanwhile, the Punjab police launched a search for Jazz. By the next day, June 9th, Jazz's body was discovered not far from where the attackers had left Mithu. Her body bore multiple deep wounds, with the fatal injury inflicted to her neck. The police contacted her relatives in Canada and sent photos for identification, but neither Malkiat Kaur nor Surjit confirmed that it was Jazz. Eventually, Mithu, along with his parents and friends, positively identified her. Jazz's relatives in Canada did not attend her funeral or claim her body. Their behavior raised suspicions with the police, who began an investigation. During the search for suspects, officers detained a known troublemaker, Anil Kumar. Anil immediately confessed that a few days before the crime, Inspector Jaginder Singh had approached him, offering money to commit an attack on Mithu. Both Anil Kumar and Jaginder Singh were arrested. During interrogation, Jaginder revealed that the mastermind behind the attack was Darshan Singh, Jazz's uncle who lived in Punjab. Darshan had promised a payment of 3 lakh rupees, roughly equivalent to $4,000. But the lingering question remained. Why did the attackers end up harming Jazz if Mithu was their only intended target? Anil Kumar explained that after the attack on Mithu, they assumed he was dead and left him in a ditch. They then forced Jazz into a car. She was unconscious, and they took her to a remote farmhouse. When Jazz regained consciousness, she demanded answers and asked about Mithu. She was told that he was dead, which filled her with rage. Anil then called Malkiat Kaur and handed the phone to Jazz. Her mother ordered her to return to Canada, but Jazz, furious and defiant, declared that she would tell everyone the truth. At that point, Surjit grabbed the phone and tried to calm the situation. While Jazz was being held under the control of the assailants, Malkiat Kaur and Surjit discussed their next steps. The perpetrators pressured Jazz to make a false statement against Mithu and return to Canada, but she refused, which only escalated their aggression. Anil called Malkiat Kaur again, informing her that Jazz would not comply. Her mother then reportedly gave her consent for them to take care of her. Surjit agreed to increase the payment, offering an additional 3 lakh rupees, approximately $4,000. Following Anil Kumar's confession and Inspector Jaginder Singh's testimony, the police arrested 11 more people, including Darshan Singh, Jazz's uncle. Back in Canada, Malkiat Kaur and Surjit Singh became primary suspects. The case sparked legal proceedings in both India and Canada. The investigation revealed that Malkiat and Surjit had orchestrated the crime, directing Darshan to handle Mithu. Darshan had enlisted Inspector Jaginder, who in turn hired Anil and his group. In October 2005, 11 of the 13 accused were convicted, though some were later released on bail. Anil Kumar, Inspector Jaginder Singh, and Darshan Singh received prison sentences. After Mithu was discharged from the hospital, he faced new charges. Authorities accused him of illegal possession of a weapon and dealing in banned substances. Additionally, a woman came forward, alleging he had tried to coerce her into a relationship. These accusations seemed unfounded, but Mithu spent another 4 years in prison before proving his innocence. During that time, he faced continuous threats from Jazz's family. They tried to bribe or intimidate him into retracting his testimony, offering money and land, but Mithu resisted both threats and bribes. For years after the crime, Malkiat Kaur and Surjit Singh lived freely in Canada, despite mounting suspicions. In 2014, India succeeded in having them extradited, but appeals allowed them to remain out of custody for several more years. At that time, Malkiat was working at a waste processing plant, and Surjit served at a local temple. It wasn't until 2012 that they were officially found guilty, although the judicial process dragged on. In January 2019, Punjab police made an attempt to arrest Malkiat Kaur and Surjit Singh, traveling all the way to Canada to do so. They were briefly detained but soon released on bail, and the case remains unresolved to this day. It has now been 24 years since the crime was committed, yet a final judgment has still not been reached. Meanwhile, Anil Kumar and Inspector Jaginder Singh are continuing to serve their prison sentences. Darshan Singh, Jazz's uncle, managed to prove his innocence in court and has since disappeared, with his whereabouts unknown. Since returning to India, Malkiat Kaur and Surjit have avoided any interactions with the media, refusing to give statements or discuss the case. Mithu, having lost the love of his life, has devoted himself to seeking justice. He has never remarried and continues to work tirelessly to restore his reputation. Despite years of court battles and numerous obstacles, he remains committed to uncovering the truth and clearing his name. This story serves as a sobering reminder of how far people are willing to go to control the lives of others and how long the road to justice can be. It highlights the importance of resilience and standing up for one's rights, as Mithu has done, fighting for dignity and justice no matter the hardships.